Now we move to the second part of the workshop, which is more interactive and workshopping. And that's going to be given by Siara Isaac. Siara has a master's degree from McGill University in chemistry, and then a PhD from the UK, from Lancaster University in educational research. She works at the EPFL in the Teaching Support Center, and her research is around teaching methods, science education, and higher education. Currently, for example, she has project in the, around skill development in bachelor or undergraduate student, and in the pedagogical development of teaching staff at university teachers. So, without further ado, I give it to Siara. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. So usually I talk to teachers, and usually we focus a lot on teaching and what should we do standing up here so that people really learn something. And the really simple answer to that is actually very little. That actually learning really happens when you're active, right? Learning happens in your brain. And so there's very little that I could do to give you a fabulous presentation. I mean, I could tell you some stuff, but in the same way that going to the symphony doesn't actually improve your skill set as a musician, that watching me give a lovely presentation doesn't increase your skill set around actually working in more collaborative and equitable ways. So you're going to be quite active during this session. The reason why I moved towards this type of work was realizing that actually if students learn when they're active, that I need to be more interested in what students are actually doing, and recognizing that moments of collaboration, of teamwork, of team projects, which we love in engineering, are also instances where students encounter significant bias, discrimination, both intentional and unintentional. And that we need to, as educational institutions, think about the experience of students in those groups and actually prepare students to work more equitably in those groups, because it's part of their learning experience and it has a significant impact on students' experience within the institution. And those small things, those small microaggressions of people saying, oh, you study math. Oh. And it doesn't matter once. But if somebody every week is surprised that you're the kind of person who studies math, then when you get in trouble on a math test, you go, oh, maybe I'm not the kind of person who studies math, rather than saying, damn, that was a bad test. That you start to self-doubt. And so that the percentage of reinforcement messages that you get of, we're happy that you're here, that I see that you've got the right skill set for this, you're where you're supposed to be, versus maybe I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Maybe I'm not in the right place. And we all feel that. But what's the balance of the messages that are coming towards you? So I'm going to get to a workshop part. I've got a couple of questions for you. So for this first question here, you're going to take out a device. A telephone is the easiest device probably. So you go to responseware.eu. It's also up there, responseware.eu, and you put in my name as the code. So mostly unfamiliar with Kahneman and a little bit more about implicit bias. Excellent. Well, then I'm very pleased then that I've chosen to take Kahneman's work as a lens to look at this. So for those of you who know more about implicit bias, you can look at where that intersects. So I'm going to start just with a brief story about, a little illustration about the way the human brain works. If this story is familiar to you, I just want you to hold on to that, which is hard to do, but just hold on to it. Stay completely silent, just hang on. If it's a new story to you, then I'm going to get you to respond through the same interface that you just responded, through the ResponseWare interface. So it's actually a very tragic and upsetting story about an attack that happened, that there was a family, a father and his children that were at home when a bomb landed on their building, and when the emergency services arrived, the father was already deceased. The child was critically injured, the little boy, and emergency services scoop up the little boy. They are rushing him to the hospital. They phone ahead up to the hospital, of course, to get the medical team ready, to let them know that there's a critically injured child who's coming in. The surgical team is scrubbed up. They're there in the operating theater waiting for the child. As the child arrives, the surgeon looks down, though, and says, I can't operate on this boy. This is my son. That's what the surgeon says, but we know that the father died in the accident. The emergency services didn't even pick up the father. So who's the doctor that looks down and says, this is my son? All right, now you are a non-representative group here, which is great because the research that was done as recently as 2019 with university students at Boston University, that only typically about 20% of students would identify that the surgeon was likely to be the child's mother. And often so his father, and I've had a student in my class look up and go, she was like, I gotcha. He's got two dads. It's his stepfather, it's adoptive father, it's birth father. There's so many reasons why people find to explain who that white man in the lab coat who is the surgeon is when they're trying to complete that story. So both doing this with university students and doing it with, I think the population sample is the same group of researchers from Boston University. I think there were 8 to 10-year-old children, 9 to 11-year-old children. Again, it was typically about 20%, 25% of the responses would be identifying that the surgeon could be the child's mother. Because that's the easiest association. I mean, we've got such a fabulous example here that the wall behind you here says arts above it, and it is almost exclusively populated by female figures. The wall in front of you here, white as well, the wall here at the front is science and has predominantly male figures on it. So this cultural soup in which we exist, it's not just your values, it's not just your ideas, it's not just whether or not you think men can be nurses or that women can be surgeons, but it's the messages that you get from advertising, from all the representations that are around you that, you know, if you imagine yourself as a dumpling floating in soup, well, the soup you're floating in is pretty racist, homophobic, transphobic, and so you tend to take on a bit of that flavor. That doesn't mean that's your core, but you've got that flavor. And so that being more aware of that tendency to make that automatic decision making and to figure out how do you manage it? How do you lean against it when it's important to you, when you need to do it differently? I'm just going to come back to the story that I told you briefly and the story that Mahzareen Banerjee, who is one of the researchers behind Project Implicit at Harvard, she does this story with her students, and in one particular instance, one of her students was so frustrated with her own answer that she began banging her head against the desk in front of her. And Mahzareen went to see her at the break to say, you know, we need to be gentle with ourselves. This is really common. And the student looks up and looks at Mahzareen and says, but my mother is a surgeon. And that's about this flavor. So about recognizing that this is the soup that we're in, and you're going to have some of this flavor, even if it's not what you believe, recognizing, and so in part, absolving yourself a little bit of that you've taken on that flavor, but being really proactive in terms of making sure that it's not having an unintended impact on your decision-making and interactions. So first we're going to do that increased awareness of this tendency, and then we're going to talk more specifically about so what? How do you counter it? So Daniel Kahneman's thinking is model, so he's a Nobel laureate in economics, is as though we have two parallel systems running in our brain, obviously not corresponding to an anatomical system, but metaphorically we've got these two systems running in parallel. System one is always active. It is there parsing the information that's arriving from the world. And it's really rapid and intuitive, which is fabulous because even before the modern age, we have lived in an incredibly sensorially rich environment. And it doesn't take a lot of time or energy to make decisions to allow us to navigate and move through this world. It doesn't pay attention to the quality of data. It doesn't say, but I'm only seeing a narrow slice here. Is that actually representative of a larger section? Oh, well, you know, this person is speaking really passionately, but that's but it's a very anecdotal thing. It's 100% of the data that I have on this aspect, it's reliable. And by filling in patterns, by the really strong human capacity to identify patterns and to infer from that, to extrapolate from that, it allows us to make a huge amount of decisions and navigate through the world. And it is incredibly useful to us. But when System 1 gets surprised, when it's not able to deal with something, then it nudges System 2 and gets it to kick in. And System 2 is a much more intentional, rational, reasoned thought. When you think about who you are, about how you relate to the world, you're going to identify much more with System 2 because that's the thinking that you're more aware of. That's your conscious, applied thinking. It's much slower, it takes more time and energy, but it allows you to actually make better decisions. And these two systems are really useful. They work really well in parallel. They allow us to do different things. But the problem is that sometimes System 1 answers the question when it should have bumped System 2 to intervene. So, for instance, with the example about the child and the surgeon, that the question that was asked was, who is statistically most likely to be this child's parent? And it's most likely that the child has a mother. The child may have a stepfather, biological father, and a gay father, all of those. But statistically speaking, many more children have mothers than have multiple fathers. But based on the inferences, we make it a faster decision. But sometimes it's useful to us. So I've got, give you an opportunity to sort of apply this distinction through the same interface again. I'd like you to identify which of these examples of decision-making are System 1 thinking. Which people are using System 1 thinking in their decision-making here? All right, so we've got really good consensus here. There's a little bit of inconsistency for B, D, and E. Based on time, I'm gonna jump ahead here. If you feel that your answer is not consistent with other people's for any of these, I'm gonna get you to check in with them at lunch, and I'm gonna just move forward for the moment to get onto the more applied part. So what? What do we care? I mean, because it's actually really great. I mean, well, certainly A and B are really useful, right? We don't want to have to slow down and really think when we're trying to walk through the halls and not bump into people. It's really fabulous that you can do that System 1 thinking and actually carry on a conversation at the same time as walking through the busy halls and not colliding with people. I'm not sure it's great for Frederick, but that's a larger societal question. So what? When does this actually become a problem to us? So this is a study by Mokrakusin and colleagues in the US. There's been a lot more funding for this type of work over there. So many of the studies that, I think actually in this instance, all the studies that I will present to you are from there. You can listen to my accent and try and identify my background. But this study by Mokrakusin and colleagues, they sent email to, I don't know how many science faculty members, but 127 of them responded and said that they would participate and give feedback to this student who was applying for a lab manager job. So these professors each thought that they got a CV from an individual student and that their job was to give this student feedback about their match between their skill set and the job that they were applying for. And in fact, there was one identical CV, but some of the CVs said John at the top and some of the CVs said Jennifer at the top. And so John, apparently those letters are much more competent, that he was judged as more hireable, and that the faculty members would be willing to spend more time mentoring John than they would Jennifer. And this difference was the same for both male and female faculty members. It did not depend on the identity of the faculty member, how they interpreted this person's CV. Another really lovely example of this came out from the Athena Swan program in the UK. In the chemistry department at the University of York, they went through their usual hiring procedure for a professor, just paying attention at each step. They did things exactly the way they usually do, but they tried to collect data at each step about how things were going. And what they identified was that when they were going from sort of the short list of 50 candidates to the short list of 5 or so, that they would have, the committee was sitting around the table, they would typically have a man's dossier open for about 7-8 minutes before coming to a decision about whether or not they were on the short list or not. And a woman's dossier only open for about 4 minutes before coming to the same decision. So and they didn't see this until they collected the data on it to actually be able to see how they were reading it. The study by Marsden and colleagues from a large German engineering institution identified that 21% of their female students said that they had witnessed gender-based discrimination on campus. But only 6% of male students from the same institution said that they had witnessed gender-based discrimination. Because if it doesn't surprise you, you don't see it. If you're not surprised that it's always Renee that's asked to take notes every meeting. Oh, we've got somebody coming. Can you get them a hotel and there's a dinner? And if it doesn't surprise you that we always ask Renee to do that and never Peter, then you don't even see it. And so the fact that you may not be seeing this doesn't mean that it's not near you. Maybe you see it based on gender. Do you see the transphobia, the homophobia? I'm saying, do you see? What I mean, because these are my questions, do I see? Am I seeing this? Am I perpetuating this? How do I get better at seeing this? And again, maybe this is my quantitative background. It seems that it becomes most apparent when we actually look for data and we can measure that. I don't know if you've seen the reports in the media just this week that we finally actually have a female crash test dummy. Now, it still isn't law that anybody uses it, but there is now actually an anatomically representative female crash test dummy. Like the Wikipedia page says that a crash test dummy is an anatomically representative and it's a typical dummy is 73 kilos and, sorry, I don't have the exact number there in front of me, I can't read it, is 175 centimeters, 78 kilograms. They recognized that this wasn't representative for women, so then they created a scaled down version of the male dummy, which is actually the size of a 12-year-old, which is also not representative of women. And women have really significant differences in their pelvises and their hips. And so the result of this is that traffic accidents are much more fatal to women. It's only because traffic accidents are 17% more fatal to women that we stepped back and went, well, why? Where is this coming from? Oh, interesting, the safety setup is entirely for a different anatomy. So when we have the data, it can be much easier to act. So you've got your system 1, your system 2. They're both really useful to you, but sometimes, obviously, we need to nudge system 2 and get it engaged to improve our decision making more often. So how do we do that? Oof. Sorry, I'm taking more time than I wanted. So I'm going to tell you just 2 stories. This first story from Hoffman and colleagues takes place in a large U.S. Hospital in which they collected data over a number of weeks and identified that African American patients were being chronically underprescribed analgesic medication. So there's a standardized system for reporting pain, the Montreal Pain Protocol, and looking at what patients were reporting in terms of their pain and the analgesics that were prescribed. This is actually not new. This has been very well documented in many instances. What's important about this study, though, is that they then fed that information back to the medical team. They said, this is what has been observed in your hospital over the last number of weeks. And they instituted just a little additional slowdown and check so that whenever a prescribing physician had selected an analgesic through the online system, there'd be just a little pop-up that said, just check. And that difference between having the data and having it slow down and check meant that the discrepancy between people's racial identity and the analgesics they were prescribed disappeared within a couple of weeks. Airbnb actually has done something similar with their data, where they did a massive review and identified that some people, particularly African Americans, were much more likely to have their requests to stay declined relative to whiter people. And so apparently now as a host on Airbnb, if you, so first they put in a code of conduct and you have to agree to adhere to a non-discriminatory code of conduct. And then as a host, if someone says, I'd like to stay the first week in December, if you decline that, there's a little pop-up that says, our algorithms indicate that you only have a 23.4% chance of having another request for the same period. Are you sure that you don't want this guest? And again, that difference has really decreased. Now, none of these are about actually addressing intentional discrimination. None of these are actually about reducing prejudice as it exists, but rather mitigating the system one decision-making that leads us to perpetuate systemic injustices. The study here with the orchestra is an observational study looking at data that starts in about 1986, I believe. They looked at the number of female musicians in the top US symphony orchestras, which was very low and was stable. And that was about the time that it became sort of industry standard to have musicians audition for the symphony behind a black curtain. So that, in fact, the information that the jury had was simply the music. But there was a jury member from City A that was participating in the jury in City B, exceptionally, and he realized that although the audition was taking place behind a black curtain, he actually had a really clear idea of who was auditioning. Because as the musician came in behind the curtain, you could tell of whether or not there was a high-heeled click, click, click or not. And so the industry standard now is to audition behind a black curtain barefoot. Because the human mind is so attentive to sensory data that when you say, well, we're not going to pay attention to, or we're just going to neglect, if you have that information available to you, it is going to influence your decision making. And so if you don't want to, if you don't think that someone's appearance is relevant to the job that you're hiring for, then you need to cut their pictures off the CV. Do not have that information there. Now, it may be that somebody's identity is relevant to the position you're hiring for. I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. I think you need to make an intentional case based on whether or not what is relevant for this position. And if it's not, if their age is not relevant, if their marital status is not relevant, then remove that information. Do not ever see it. Don't say, we're not going to look at that. There's some suggestions here for what you can do and apply in, you'll be able to apply for your, on your little cards at the end. Okay, so I'm going to move now to getting you guys more active. And you are each going to have something to read. So your job is to make a nice little summary of this. What would you tell someone who hasn't read what you're reading? What are the key points that you're going to pull out of that? And then there's one person in your group who has an activity called Space Arc. I have excellent news for you. There is, in fact, no meteor, and we do not actually have to figure out which 6 people are going on the rocket ship. Now, I know that you've got involved in that cognitive challenge now, and you're very committed to your list of 6 people. Deep breath, step back. You're going to take that piece of paper with you. You can refine your perfect list later. I'd like you now to think about the process. Not what you decided, but how you went about making those decisions. How were you collaborating? How were you setting up your decision making? Step back now to the process. How were you doing it? How did the interactions feel for different people? What strategies did you use? You've got an observer to help you with this debriefing. So this activity that you've just done is actually a really nice way to set up a group that's going to be collaborating going forward. To create that space in terms of how do we want to function together as a group? What are the strategies that we're actually going to put in place to do that? So you'll have shared with you through the organizers these PDFs. You are welcome to organize this activity in any context that's useful to you, but it's something that often happens at the EPFL as student teams are starting. That within a course project, that on the first day if the teams have been made, that they do this sometimes I facilitate this activity, sometimes a teacher does it themselves, of getting the teams to set up. so that actually that the students are thinking about, okay, we've got an exchange student again and they don't speak French fluently, and that's just it's not just a pain in the neck. There's actually an added value to actually working across that difference. It's going to improve our decision making if we put in place these strategies. Also being really clear about your criteria for your decision making, and setting up your criteria before you look at any of the options. Agreeing on those criteria before you apply them will make any collaborative decision making that you have to do faster, and you will come up with much higher quality decision. That some of my favorite resources is a book, Deep Diversity by Shakil Chaudhuri, which is about really looking at how do you make that little shifts in your own brain in terms of trying to externalize some of the racism and sexism that you've digested. Obviously there's the Project Implicit's research papers, but they also have this very readable book, Blind Spot. And through their website, implicit.harvard.edu, you can do their implicit attitudes tests. And implicit attitudes tests give you a sense of your ability to make rapid decisions of associating, for instance, women in arts and men in science as one of the tests. And it doesn't tell you about how you're going to react in any given situation, and is obviously really subject to your cognitive load in that moment. So in a moment, if you really want to try and get a clear idea of where your biases are most likely to be problematic, of where that's likely to be tripping you up, if you do those tests when you are hungry, frustrated, annoyed, under stress, that will bring out the bias that you need to address. That if you do it in a moment where you're super relaxed, focused, centered, your ability to manage that bias is much higher. And that's fabulous. But of course, in your collaborations, working with people, you often work with people under deadlines, frustrated, before lunch, too early in the morning, and that's when you need to be particularly careful about minding those biases. I've also written up a paper based on this activity and another activity that I created called Make It Awkward, which is about responding reactively to problematic comments, to discrimination in the moment. And that, yeah, it's a long process. You're right. hopefully that'll be accepted soon. I think that what really struck me from Chris's presentation this morning is about how much of this work he's doing as science work. And if there's a limited number of people that are doing this work, things both move very slowly, and that's an additional unequal burden that some people are carrying. That this is something that the female engineering students on campus for us nod at really vigorously, that yes, whenever there's something sexist said, everybody in the group turns to me, that I am, as the one woman, expected to respond to every sexist comment. And so recognizing that if we all pick up a piece of that, the work becomes much lighter, and not expecting certain people to carry all of that. So this is an anecdotal version of the story, but I have, but this is something that I've seen reported in more official ways as well. I was at a Learning Sciences conference this spring and happened to be sitting at a workshop table with a number of researchers with Indigenous identities, Australian, Canadian, American, and they were sharing their stories about how once the Indigenous students know that you're Indigenous, it doesn't matter if your door's closed, that they come and find you, that they know that they can count on you to have that support, and they bring their stories and they come and find you. And if there is no Indigenous faculty on campus, there is no door for those students. And so when we say it doesn't matter, so I think it's a perfectly valid decision in your SARC to say people's background doesn't matter. But I think you can also make a case for why people's background does matter. That actually having queer faculty means that is a door that queer students go to say, we're going on this 2-week trip, and we're going to be in this remote trip, and we're going to have to share accommodation, and I can tell that it's making other people uncomfortable. How am I going to deal with this? And who do you take that to? If not, you can take it to another student, but to actually have faculty that people can take this to, this is coming back to the criteria that Chris talked about in terms of when we're identifying what excellence is and who we need on campus, yes, publications, but also there's really important aspects of the community that we're creating and the space that we're creating for those students.
Workshop. Are there any questions for Siara? We have 5 minutes or so.
So I don't want to put the emphasis on the negative, but you've been doing this exercise many times, and you've been observing teams many times at their work. What is the most common mistake people do?
I think the most common mistake
Conscious or unconscious? Because
is to not check in with what the skill sets are that people are bringing. To immediately start on the decision making and not to say, so what can you bring to this? Does anybody have a background in biology, in reproductive biology, in space stations? Or do you, this is a really limited task, but actually thinking about, in a really broad sense, what aspects of your identity are you bringing that are relevant for this collaboration? Who do you know professionally? What do you do? What context do you have in the community about people that will be affected by this project, or community space that we have for this, or languages? To actually, what is your whole identity that you're bringing to this? So we're doing that capacity mapping, and then getting into details really quickly before setting criteria for decision making. Definitely.
Do we have any other questions?
I was wondering how you would engage the discussion about how to evaluate and appreciate the diversity in a group, and not to end up in argument like, he or she was hired because black, white, pink, or because woman, man, or an alien, or because very often people say, but we are putting science in a second position in priority rather than the first one. And it's a very tricky argument to discuss with people.
Yeah, because the story that we tell ourselves is that science is unbiased and objective, right? That what's written in the journals is objective. That if I think in a scientific way, I'm thinking in an objective way, and therefore I'm not influenced. That it's inappropriate to be influenced by. And so you're arguing with someone who sees their identity as a scientist and therefore as objective, and telling them that they're not objective. And fundamentally, they're not objective. We are not objective. And that actually, the way that Chris started in terms of his positionality, this is who I am. And to recognize that based on who you are, you see and don't see certain things. And a recognition that although a friend that lives on the same street as me, that works in the same institution as me, she does not walk the same life that I walk, because her identity is different than mine. We both speak French as a second language, but the accent in which we speak French as a second language changes significantly the way that we're seen. And it's really uncomfortable to tell people that, to say, you're a scientist and you're not objective. So I think that it's about having people see, I think that some of the research, for instance, in that Harvard Business Review article about the quality of decision making and why that diversity matters, and why the diversity matters when it actually gets read. And then for me, ultimately, it comes down to human rights. That, when people say, it's political correctness, I'm not worried about offending people. I'm not trying to be politically correct. It's an issue of human rights. And because people say, you push too hard, you're not Swiss, you don't understand the context here. Human rights, right? I hear, we take that's fundamental in this culture, and what I'm telling you is human rights. And I think it's really hard when you feel personally, when somebody says to you, you got that grant because of who you are. And that's hard for people to feel that. I mean, I've heard white male PhD students at my institution say, it's impossible for me to get a job. Everything is so biased against me, I'll never get a job. And I say, so let's do a little thought experiment, because, let's say that in fact it is really difficult for you to get hired as a white man in a professorship right now. Let's say that is in fact the case, but for decades, it was actually impossible for women to enter university or to get a higher degree. So So let's say things are tips that that we won't hire white men now. How long do we have to do that for to balance for the last 400 years? I don't know. Do you think it's like 5 minutes or 4 years? But let's say that is in fact the case. It is unjust now, but there are reasons why we have to act decisively in order to get to an equilibrium point. And I think that often the young people are most hesitant to this. It got rejected, but Eindhoven, I think, declared that they would only hire female professors, that they were going to try to adjust that balance by only hiring female professors, and it was contested by law and refuted. But there's a really interesting opinion piece written by one of their female students saying, I don't agree with this because I don't think this is the right place to start. Why does she think we're starting in 2020 adjusting gender as a problem in institutions? And it's a problem with young people to think about gender. And so that position can also be useful for them in terms of, so when your grandmother was born, in the country that she was born in, could she legally own a house? Could she vote? When your mother was born in the country that she was born in, could she legally own a house? And could she vote? We're not talking about hundreds of years ago. We're talking about people now. And so that contextualization. But ultimately, I think, what do I think about minding that? I take it to my friends and I get them to patch me back up again for getting ripped a bit for defending it. I don't think that's a very good answer.
Thanks. It's some good advice. Any last quick questions? We can squeeze one. You want to fight? 2? We can squeeze 2. Okay. I'll go to you first.
No, I'd be a bit more direct. There's lots of research showing that like women and other marginalised communities actually are more qualified than white men for the same position. So I don't even think you need to argue the case that there's an unfair advantage being conferred upon these marginalised people. They're actually qualified or typically overqualified for the same position. And the CV example, the John and Jennifer one, is a really good example of that. The tables are tipped against those people. So whenever people say that to me, and it happens all the time, there's lots of numbers if they want to go and look at it to show that that's not true. There was a paper in PNAS earlier this year as well, which looked at health, educational, financial outcomes for people. And again, white, cis, het, middle-class men did better than every other group across, I think, 34 intersectional identities that were measured. So there's lots of data out there to go and point to people that suggest that what they're arguing in this white male student's case is just manifestly not true.
I guess that's a nice response to scientists. Where's your data?
My question goes towards, to what extent would it be useful to use personal traits in a team setting and using algorithms? So there's a number of HR platforms out there, and some of the startups are actually looking at team composition and what would benefit in the team from a very mathematical point of view. So these are personal traits that are, I think, acquired through about 50, 60, 70 questions. They seem to be very robust in terms of what they characterize as a person. And there are companies that are thinking about using these or using them as a complement to the hiring process. So seeing who do I need and which of the applicants through such a process would fit in.
So my background is education, not HR. As you will see here from my screensaver, if that's what comes up next, that I'm interested in people learning. And we learn when we, is that going to sit down? No, I can't get my desktop back there. We learn when we're outside of our comfort zone. There you go. That's where the magic happens. That's your comfort zone down there. And so from an educational point of view, I don't want to put people in teams in roles where they are comfortable, because they already have that skill set. If you're a great planner, I don't want you planning in your student team, because you already have that skill set. Somebody else does the planning, you need to do the programming, because it's about skill development. So HR is very different, right? They're focused on developing the product, but in the same way that you were making this decision, actually, from an educational setting, typically we're not that interested in the product. That in fact, when you go to your first employer, they don't say, please bring your robot with you that you made in third year. That actually we want the skill set that they're taking with them. But we get very focused. We grade the robot. We say the robot is what matters. We write up the article in the student paper about the robot. That's not what matters. It's the skill set that's going in students' pockets. And so my work is more about how to get students to fill the role that they're not comfortable filling, so that they don't say, oh, that's the kind of person that does usually programming, that's the kind of person who does the communication, and that we reinforce those roles in the team of the skill sets that people have already been used to taking on. And that rather within a student team, you get a team to start by saying each person in the team identifies what they would like to get out of this team project in terms of their own skill set. That for me, I'd like to get better at communication and at connecting with the community, so I'm going to take on those types of roles. Someone else can take on sponsorship roles, not because they're good at it, but because those are the skill sets that they want, and then to be seconded or backed up by someone. So very different than the HR is actually going to sell the robot. I'm interested in the skill set that goes in students' pockets that they take away.
Thank you very much. If we can thank Sarah again for the discussion and questions.